Trader Joe, otherwise known as Charlie's dad, recently sent me several really cool items. One of the items was this little fixed blade knife made by a giant mouse. Joe suggested that I should try to make handle scales for it. I decided that it was way too nice of a knife to risk damaging it. But I did like the size and shape, so I was inspired to try to make something similar. I'm not very experienced at making knives. I've only attempted it a few times using old files I found at yard sales. This time I wanted to try something more refined. Maybe not as nice as a giant mouse or a diving sparrow. More along the lines of a squawking chuck. I traced the shape of the knife onto a piece of 083 thick, fully annealed 1075 steel. I ordered this steel from McMaster-Carr. I chose 1075 because it is supposedly the easiest to heat treat. I used my angle grinder and a cutoff wheel to cut out the rough shape. A bandsaw would have been really handy for this task. I used the thicker grinding wheel on this curved section. Here's the blank roughed out with the angle grinder. I continued shaping the blank with my 1x30 belt sander. I was using a fresh 120 grit belt. I wore gloves because at this stage the blank had no heat treat, so I could let it get hot while I shaped it. I used a couple different diameter sanding drums in my drill to do the curved sections. Here's the blank after all of my shaping efforts. I used some cardboard to mock up what I wanted the scales to look like. I used my template to figure out where I wanted the pins. I chose 1/8 diameter solid brass for 2 pins and 1/4 inch OD tube to also act as a lanyard hole. I made this fixture out of scrap wood to help me sand the bevels. I used the pinholes to mount the blank to the fixture. I wanted my bevel to be about 5/8 of an inch wide. The blank was 83 thousandths thick, and I wanted to leave about 20 thousandths at the edge to avoid cracking during heat treating. So I did some high school geometry to figure that I needed about a 3-degree angle. I tilted the table of my belt sander 3 degrees past 90. Using my fixture, I could present the blank to the sanding belt at my 3-degree angle. I was very careful to start sanding at the same spot on both sides of the blank. I had a little bit of trouble with my technique on the first side, but I did a little better on the other side. Here's the blank sanded down to 400 grit. I used a round file to clean up the transition and add a relief. I decided I wanted to try adding what I think the knife pros call jimping to the back of the blade. The next step was lots of hand sanding. I wanted to do as much sanding as I could while the steel was still soft. Here's the blank sanded down to 600 grit. I used my homemade forge to heat treat the blank. I have a video about how I made this little forge. I'll leave a link at the end of the video. I heated the blank until it wouldn't stick to a magnet. Then I heated it just a little bit more and then quenched it in canola oil. I check the blade with a file. If the file just skates on the surface without biting into the metal, you know you have a good quench. I sanded the blade with 600 grit back to bright metal. Then I tempered it in my kitchen oven at 400 degrees for 1 hour, let it cool, and baked it again for another hour at 400 degrees. This tempering will turn the steel a gold color. I think the knife pros call it straw temper. Tempering gives the blade some toughness to resist chipping. I used my Lansky kit to put an edge on the blade. I had to spend a good bit of time with the coarse stone because of how thick I left the blank when beveling. I was able to get a pretty even edge using the coarse stone. Once I had the edge established, I began sanding the blade with wet and dry paper and WD-40. Here's the blade wet sanded down to 1000 grit. At this point, I felt like I could add the scales. I decided to use some ebony sent to me by T-Rex for the scales. I used my jigsaw to cut the scales to rough shape. I spent some time finish sanding this end, since it would be hard to reach once it was glued to the blade. Here's the scales and pins dry fitted to the blade. I used 30-minute clear epoxy to glue everything up. After the epoxy had cured overnight, I trimmed the pin ends with my Dremel and a cutoff wheel. I used a 120 grit belt in my sander to shape the scales. I had my shop vac hooked up to the sander to minimize the wood dust. I used the sanding drums again on the curved sections. Here's the scales roughly sanded. I use my table saw as a flat surface to sand down the thickness of the handle. Here's the handle after over an hour of hand sanding. I progressed from 60 down to 320 grit. Then I buffed the scales with superfine steel wool. Chuck and I polished the blade with flits before I did the final sharpening. Can you see yourself, Chuck? Here's the giant mouse knife Joe very generously sent me. What do you think of my version? I gave the scales several coats of Johnson's paste wax. It certainly isn't perfect, but I think it came out pretty good considering it is only my third attempt at a knife. I have a lot of respect for the craftsmen that make custom knives. You have to master a lot of skills to make a high quality knife. Well, Chuck, I don't think we're ever going to be knife makers, but we did make a knife. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.